The advice that he is giving in 2008. Check this out.
If there was ever a time to panic, is this it? Sounds pretty gloomy.
Absolutely not.
What? And make sure you stay to the end of the video because you're going to become a much better and smarter investor by understanding Dave's mistakes. And I'm not talking about the fact he doesn't like debt. Trust me, on this video, you are going to hear some things that you have never heard before. Let's start by looking at a clip of Dave Ramsey giving real estate advice to a caller in 2019 from California.
We're going to rent our in-laws' house, wait for the market to drop, and then buy back in.
Problem is we don't know when your market is going to crash enough for you to be motivated to jump back in. If it waits 10 years, it won't crash enough to come down to where it is today. That won't work mathematically.
Okay.
There are 3 huge mistakes that Dave Ramsey makes that you should avoid at all costs. And I want to point out really quickly. You may say, yeah, George, but we're talking about a house, not really an investment. I want to remind everyone that the average American, their home is the biggest investment they will ever make in their entire lives. Okay, starting with number 1 here, we've got FOMO. This is the fear of missing out. So when Dave talks about the market could just go up, up, up and never come back down, that is a classic example of FOMO. Number 2, his opinion is completely void of historical info, data, and economic analysis. Number 3, it ignores probabilities and it is heavily skewed because of recency bias. And what recency bias is it's the belief that whatever has happened in the most recent past will continue to happen in the future. As someone who has been a successful entrepreneur and investor in several different countries, I have seen these types of mistakes completely destroy people. Let me tell you a quick story. In 2007, I was renting a condo, and my landlord at the time was a great guy. We'll say his name was Tom. And Tom had it all. He had a successful business, he had 2 kids, gorgeous wife. By any stretch of the imagination, he had a perfect life. I rented that place instead of buying because I just couldn't justify the purchase because at that time real estate prices were so high. Now Tom did the opposite. He actually bought. He had a fear of missing out. He had that recency bias. And he thought to himself, if I don't buy now, I could never again be able to buy at this price. About 1.5 years later, the property manager called me and asked if I could send the next month's rent check to an XYZ trust instead of Tom. And I thought that was a little strange, so I said, sure, but is there something wrong? Is there a reason why? And she sounded a little taken back and she said, oh, I guess you haven't heard. I said, heard what? And she said, well, Tom unfortunately lost almost everything in the real estate crash. His wife left him, and unfortunately, a couple days ago, Tom killed himself. Of course, I was completely in a state of shock. The last time that I had seen Tom, he had the perfect life. And I remembered back to 2006 and the fact that Tom and I had a decision to make, whether to buy into the real estate market when prices were extremely expensive or to hold off. And I knew that if I would have made a different decision back in 2006, I could be in the same spot as Tom, where I could have lost everything. I know that was a sobering story, but I thought it was crucial to share that with you because it really illustrates the point that when it comes to this huge investment that is our house, it's absolutely vital that we think this through and we analyze it rationally because it has such a huge impact on not only our future, but the future of our families. Now let's go back to the caller's specific situation. He was calling in from San Bernardino, and we're going to take a look at that market as it is today using historical information, data, economic analysis, and probabilities. Here's a chart of historical housing prices in San Bernardino. But George, Dave Ramsey is talking about nominal prices. And I know he is, but it's still a terrible argument because at the end of the day, money equals purchasing power. If your home buys less stuff when you sell it than when you bought it, you lost purchasing power regardless of whether or not the price went up. We start here at 1976. At that point in time, housing prices were $150,000 in today's money. Our chart goes up to $450,000. We start here at 150, we go up, down, and then of course in 1996 that starts that trend where we shoot up here to the very top of the bubble. And keep in mind, this was the biggest housing bubble we have ever seen in the United States in 2006. We dropped down, of course, to our historic trend line in 2012. Now we're all the way back up to a point almost as high as we were at the top of the bubble in 2006. I want you to pay very close attention to the distance, to the gap, the delta that we have now between current prices and our historic trend line adjusted for inflation. Moving on to the data. We've got population, wages, and credit. This isn't to say that these are the only drivers of housing prices, but these are the three main drivers, so that's what we'll focus on right now. Population in this LA area. The percentage growth is in decline. That's not to say that the whole entire population is shrinking, but if it's on a downward trend. And if you take that trend, if it keeps going, by 2020, 2021, you actually will be losing. The population will be decreasing in this LA area. Wages, they've been on a slight rise, adjusted for inflation, since 1970, but not that dramatic. And the price to income, as far as the average housing price relative to the average income, is the highest in the entire country. In some counties in Los Angeles, it takes you 20 annual salaries to buy a house. It's absolutely crazy. Credit, interest rates worldwide are at 5,000-year lows. We've got the most mortgage debt in the United States we've ever had in history. Mortgage rates are at all-time lows. Now let's go into the probabilities, and this is the part that most people absolutely miss, and it is so crucial. Let's check out why. Dave's premise is that at a certain point in time, you have to buy. No matter what the price is, you've got to buy, because if you don't buy then prices could just keep going up and up and up.
To infinity and beyond!
So let's say there's a 100% chance of prices rising from this point. Again, this point could be now, it could be 3 years in the future. After looking at this chart for more than 3 seconds, a child could look at that and tell you that something doesn't add up there. And if we're at this level right now, and this is our historic trend line, that we've got to calculate that risk into our analysis. Starting off at 100%, sitting at home watching this video, what would you say the probabilities go down to just by looking at this chart? I'm going to give Dave Ramsey the benefit of the doubt here, and I'm going to say that it only drops down to an 80% chance because of this chart. Now it's going back to the population. So we know that the percentage of increase in California is on the decline. And if it continues down on this trend, by the time we get to 2020, 2021, the population will be decreasing. So we also have to factor that into our analysis. Based on that, we'll say the chances go down to 70%. Keep in mind that wages have stayed relatively the same. They have gone up slightly in real terms since 1970, but they're not going up at a dramatic pace. And in order to sustain these price levels or to have prices go to infinity and beyond, you would definitely have to have wages going up. So that's going to lower that probability, let's say, down to 50%. So now we're at basically a 50-50. And you say, well, George, prices can stay the same. Well, yeah, they can. We'll get into that in a moment. But you can see they don't typically stay the same for long. So going into the credit, and this is what really brings it down. Because you can argue for a population increase. You can argue for several different things here. But at the end of the day, that is minutia compared to the amount of credit in the system. And we've had 0% interest rates For 10 years in the United States, we have pulled so much demand forward from the future that once those interest rates start to rise, and remember, we're on the tail end of a 40-year downward trend, a cycle in interest rates. Once that cycle starts going back up, there's going to be less credit in the system, and that is really going to cause problems for the housing market, especially in Los Angeles and in California, because it's almost impossible for credit to actually expand further than it already is. I'm going to bring this down to 25%. So now we're at a 25% chance that housing prices increase from this level and a 75% chance that they decrease. Next, we're going to look at our max upside and our max downside. Of course, this isn't an exact science, but the whole point of this video is to get you thinking in a different way about your investment analysis. So for the moment, let's pretend that prices can't go to infinity, and we'll say that they can go up maybe by 30%, although that's incredibly unlikely if these stay constant. We've got a really good trend line here going back to, in this case, 1976, but if you take this trend line back, on the US housing market, it goes all the way back to 1900. So there's a lot of years of data to back up this trend line. And the difference between where prices are now and this historic trend line is about 55%. So for the sake of example, let's say our max upside's 30, our max downside's 55%, but we've got a greater chance based on this that we hit this max downside. So let's say that's 60% to 40%. So we've got a 60% chance of losing 55% and a 40% chance of gaining 30, and that's being extremely kind. No one in their right mind would make that investment. You want asymmetry in your investments, but you want it the opposite way. You want an investment where there's a 70% chance that you make 50%, and there's maybe a 15% chance that you lose 10. That's what you're looking for. And that's the point that I really want to drive home with this segment of the video. Time for some counter arguments. First, George, you can't time the market. And I completely agree with this. But what you can do is a thorough analysis of probabilities to the best of your ability. Let's look at it this way. If you're playing blackjack, which is a game of probabilities, and you've got a 19.
19, what would I like to do?
If you hit on that 19, do you know for sure what the next card will be? No, but you do know that the chances are extremely high that if you do hit on that 19, you're going to lose. It's no different when you're making an investment or buying a house. If the probability is high that you're going to lose money, don't buy it. This is why the first and only question that you should be asking yourself when you're thinking about making an investment is it cheap based on historical standards? By investing this way, it totally eliminates the need to time the market, and the odds will always be on your side. I want to ask you a very important question. What is the difference between gambling and investing? To answer this question, let's look at the difference between a casino and buying a home. The casino technically is gambling with the players, but in the long run, it has a 100% chance of making money. On the other hand, let's look at the person who's pinched every penny and saved every dime so they now can realize their dream of buying a home. A very prudent, dare I say, Dave Ramsey type decision. But let's say they purchased that home in 2006 and they had a 70% chance of losing money. And let's remember that prices today are just as high as they were in 2006. So the casino has a 100% chance of making money. And this homeowner who did Dave Ramsey's prudent plan in 2006 has a 70% chance of losing money. So I ask you the question, who here is the gambler and who here is the investor? My point is, Dave Ramsey is giving investment advice based on FOMO and recency bias. His advice is totally void of historical information, data, and economic analysis. And for those people who follow this just blindly and don't think about it critically, the ramifications can be incredibly dangerous. So if you're asking yourself the question, well, George, what should the caller have done? What advice would you have given that caller? You can check out my answer right here, and I will see you on the next video.